food preparation, specifically about fermentation. We're going to do a demonstration about doing sauerkraut. So if anybody feels that they're in the wrong place, it's a good time to get up and leave. But if you want to stay, Annie Drew's going to do this demonstration for us. And as I was coming over here, I was thinking, that just fermented foods, I'll be putting bacteria back into our guts, is really similar to taking care of the soil and keeping the microorganisms in the soil, because in both cases what they're doing is they're facilitating the transmission of nutrients from one medium to another. Annie Drew.
Hi, everybody. This is Alicia, and Alicia's going to help out with the demonstration today. I apologize for the change in topic, and we'll do our best to keep you interested in any event. Come on in. So, how many of you here are familiar with the name Weston A. Price? You are? Cool. Oh, okay, well, I know you are. So we've got two people that are familiar with Weston Price. I'm going to talk a little bit about Weston Price because he's the reason why I do what I do. And what I do is I teach traditional food preparation classes. And the way the classes work is they're formatted around the principles that he discovered back in the mid-1930s when he traveled the world studying indigenous cultures. So the native Indians here in San Diego, the Native Americans, utilize these same principles that we're going to talk about today. We're not going to talk about the specifics of their diet here in San Diego, but we're going to talk about the principles involved in indigenous diets. So a little bit about Weston Price. Weston Price was a dentist. He was born in Canada, and he came to the United States around the turn of the last century, and he set up a practice in Cleveland, Ohio. And during the course of his practice, for about 30 years, he noticed a radical change in the health, and especially the dental health of his patients. So around the early to mid-1920s, he started to get very concerned because the children that were coming to him were presenting with dental caries, in a large degree of dental caries. Come on in. They were presenting with malocclusion of their teeth, narrowed jaw patterns, and they tended to be more prone to dental infections. And so he was concerned. He was baffled. He said, "What's going on here? This is not what I saw in their parents or their grandparents that I treated." And so it got him to thinking. And this was a time in our world's history when there were still a few pockets of indigenous people left on the planet that were eating a diet that they had been eating for hundreds or thousands of years. And so Dr. Price set out, like a lot of explorers did around that same time, to discover what it was about their diet that made them impervious to these modern illnesses, and especially around, because he was a dentist, around dental health. National Geographic was sort of big at the time. The camera was a new invention. The airplane was a new invention. So explorers were traveling the world, and there were reports coming back, wow, there are people on the planet who don't have the same level of ill health that people in our culture are suffering from. So he decided after he retired that he and his wife would take their life savings and they would travel the world in search of these people. And they ended up going to several different continents and studying about, I think, 14 different indigenous cultures. And so he went to study the Inuits in Alaska. He studied people off the coast of Scotland and Ireland and the Outer Hebrides Islands. He studied a remote village in Switzerland in the Laurentian Valley. I wish I had photographs because he took just reams of photos of these people. He went to Africa, he went to Australia, New Zealand, South America, and he studied Native Americans in Canada and in the Florida Everglades. And what he found was fascinating. What he found was a very high degree of immunity to both dental caries or cavities and to infectious illness. So although TB was a scourge the world over at that time, these people that he studied that were still staying true to their indigenous ways did not seem to suffer from these infectious illnesses, specifically tuberculosis, even though they were coming in contact with people who had tuberculosis. So he found that absolutely fascinating. What he would do is when he would get into a village, he would interface with the elders, get a translator, and then obtain permission from the chief to examine all the members of the community. So he would line them up, little list of Vegas, and he would do what all dentists do, and he would count the cavities in their teeth. And he found, again and again, a very low percentage of cavities, extremely low. In some places he found 0% cavities, where in more modernized parts of the world, the cavity rate was extremely high at that time. Sugar was, really on the forefront, white flour, what he called the foods of modern commerce. So these, store foods, things that could be stored without refrigeration, could travel long distances, and that would not break down. So basically nutrient empty, nutrient bankrupt foods. And that's what was being exported to these parts of the world. And so people who were on their indigenous diet would sometimes move outside of their community and go interface with the Western community that had come in and start eating these foods. And immediately, Dr. Price found within one generation, the deterioration in their health was just astounding. They started getting this strange narrowing of the facial structure and of the body. The indigenous peoples he studied had very wide faces, broad dental arches, plenty of room for all the teeth, perfectly white, straight smiles. Not a single cavity in most cases. So, wow, this was big news. And he started writing about it and sending it back to medical journals and dental journals here in the United States. He was not the only person to find this phenomenon. There were several other explorers at the time that were seeing the same thing, finding the same thing. Even in Columbus's journals, a lot of the same types of things were written a long time ago. So in any event, he thought, well, it's something in the food. Clearly something protective in their diet that we don't have, or we no longer eat on a regular basis. So he took samples of the food and samples of the soil in these parts of the world, sent them back to a lab in Ohio and had them analyzed. And what he found was that the foods that the indigenous people were eating were 10 times higher in fat-soluble vitamins. So that would be A, D, K, and E. Just write that down. So they're 10 times higher than what you can find in the United States at that time. He found that the water-soluble vitamins were 4 to 5 times higher than what you could find in food in Western culture. So he said, well, there's something about those fat-soluble activators that's protective. Something about it. And so he continued to research, and what he discovered is that these fat-soluble activators, most specifically these two, are responsible for laying down minerals in the bones and in the teeth. And without A and D, minerals are excreted. So where do you find these fat-soluble activators? He called this one, by the way, Activator X. At the time, didn't know what this was. This is vitamin K2 that he found in great abundance in these foods. And he's like, wow, what is that? I don't know what that is. Well, only recently have they discovered what this Activator X was, and it ends up that it's vitamin K2, which is not a vitamin per se, but it's more of an organism. And it tends to be associated with fermentation. So that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. Without A and D, the minerals were excreted. Without K2, they were laid down, but they were laid down in the soft tissue, not in the bone. So you get calcification like kidney stones, gallstones, arteriosclerosis, things like that. And with adequate A, D, and K2, mineral absorption was complete. And that's what protected these people from dental caries. So that was big news. Where do you find these fat-soluble activators? Well, they're found in animal foods. Specifically, they're found in animal foods when the animals are pastured. In other words, they're eating grass, or they're foraging. So if they're ruminants, like cows, goats, sheep, they're eating grass. They're pigs, they're foraging in the woods, and they're eating acorns and whatever else they can find. If they're chickens, if they're fowl, poultry, then they're pecking the ground and they're eating insects. So something about pastured, the whole pasturing process for animals makes these fat-soluble vitamins concentrated in the fatty tissue of the animals. So that was his big, huge discovery, and only now are people starting to recognize that pasturing animals. How many of you are familiar with this whole sort of pasture raised? Yeah, it's big news now. It took that many years.